So the holiday season is here, and you know what that means. Sales on pretty much every digital game distribution platform in existence. With that in mind, I was perusing GOG the other week and happened upon TimeShift, a first-person shooter game developed by Saber Interactive and published by Sierra Entertainment. Honestly, I've considered picking up TimeShift multiple times in the past, as it's one of those titles that really takes me back to the early Xbox 360 era. A time in my life when Gears of War ruled Xbox Live, and I still sort of like Sonic 06. I still might sort of like Sonic 06. Might be a video someday, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I actually remember playing the demo for TimeShift on 360 and enjoying it. If I remember correctly, it was a portion of the first level where you got to mess around with some of the game's distinct mechanics without getting smacked in the face with the difficulty curve, more on that later. I didn't end up playing the whole game though, because it was this weird point in my life where I was still a broke 16-year-old kid, but my parents had stopped renting things from Blockbuster. And honestly, my interest in this game was that of a weekend rental, not a game I'd ask for Christmas or anything like that. So the game just sort of came and went and I forgot about it. 13 years later, I have it finally loaded up on my PC and I'm ready to give it the shot that I couldn't really give it back then. As mentioned before, TimeShift is a first-person shooter game, but what sets it apart from others of that time is its time manipulation mechanic. Players have the ability to either slow, stop, or rewind time for a short period, indicated by a recharging blue bar on the left. Each different power has its own specific use. Slow is most effective in combat when you need to focus on headshots or just staying alive. Stop is best for obstacles in the game, particularly when you need to throw a switch and either get through a door or get on a platform before the switch resets. Also, I never really did this during my playthrough, but you can run up to an enemy in slow or stop mode and steal their weapon, which is also pretty cool. Slow and stop can be used relatively interchangeably, but rewind time is only really needed for specific situations. For example, I needed to get into a warehouse and the only way in was through an opening caused when a container was placed outside. The solution is simple: you get inside the container and rewind time to bring you back inside the building. Despite only using this in very specific and very clearly distinguished points in the game, I found this to be a pretty cool mechanic, especially for the time period. Granted, it's not super unique or anything, but it helps distinguish it just a bit from other FPS games of the time. Then there's the actual moment-to-moment combat of the game, which isn't so unique, but definitely functional. Let's start with the controls. For the most part, they're standard: WASD to move, R to reload, C to crouch, and so on and so forth. But the one weird alteration is with the zoom. The game has what it calls a mini zoom, which is mapped to the E key by default for some reason. I missed the tip in the tutorial that explained the mini zoom, so let's just say that the first hour or so of this game was a doozy for me, but regardless, it is extremely useful for lining up shots both in and out of time slowing or stopping mechanics. This mini zoom was done presumably because each weapon's alt fire is mapped to the right mouse button by default. Stuff like a grenade launcher for the rifle, burst fire for the pistol, etc. The only problem is that some of the weapons like the crossbow and the sniper rifle have their zoom function mapped to the alt fire. This can cause a bit of confusion even if the keys are rebound, as most games treat alt fire and zoom as either separate buttons or the same button. Never this kind of weird halfway thing that TimeShift is going for. For the latter specifically, I think of a game like Doom 2016, where every gun has an alt fire and some of the guns have a zoom as their alt fire, but there is no additional button that zooms every weapon. Not a major issue or anything, but I did find it to be a bit odd throughout my playthrough. Another odd thing about this game is its strange difficulty curve, at least in my experience. For reference, I played this game on Skilled, which was the middle difficulty, which is usually my go-to. I found that this game is actually much harder in the beginning and gets easier as the game progresses. You have 3 weapon slots when you start. You're given access to an auto rifle, a pistol, and a shotgun, all medium to close range weapons. The game then proceeds to place you in some arenas where enemies are quite far away, but still close enough to shoot you. Combine that with my lack of knowledge of the mini zoom at first, and I found myself dying constantly in this one particular spot that really could have used some more cover to help you advance up the field more. Then, later in the game, you gain access to more long-range weapons, and the game becomes a lot easier. At first, you get the sniper rifle, which, with well-timed use of the slow mechanic, becomes a bit of a point-and-click adventure starring the enemies' heads. Then the game hands you a crossbow with exploding arrows called the Thunderbolt. Asking the brave question of what if we made the torque bow from Gears of War, but with no drawbacks, the Thunderbolt becomes the win button for the most part. You just slow time, zoom, and tag enemies with arrows, and watch most of them blow up when time catches back up. Add a submachine gun that you get later in the game that sets people on fire, and a rocket launcher, and you have your loadout for the rest of the game. fiery submachine gun up close, exploding crossbow for long range, and a rocket launcher for whatever the previous two don't work on. The game does seem to have anticipated this though, as it compensates by giving you just enough of the time manipulation powers to be effective, but nothing more than that, and also a laughably small health bar. I know that what you see in the HUD may seem fine, but trust me, get caught out in the open during a fight with your time powers on recharge and you're probably dead. While that specifically was a source of pretty intense frustration at the start of the game, it became normal as I progressed and I found better weapons. The game is designed around its time manipulation mechanic, and the developers didn't want them to feel like just an option during combat, so that makes sense to me. Overall, from a gameplay perspective, I think TimeShift is a bit janky, but definitely still playable and fun. It doesn't have the same timeless feel that similar games of that time like Halo 3 and COD 4 have, but I still enjoyed it. Where the game kind of falls apart though is pretty much everywhere else. Look, I am a firm believer of the idea of gameplay being the most important factor in games. A game with great moment-to-moment gameplay is worth playing, even if the aesthetics are hideous or the story is the worst thing ever created by the human mind. TimeShift is neither of these extremes, just to be clear, but its look and narrative both firmly land in the critical no man's land that I like to call forgettable. The majority of what you're going to be looking at in this game looks like a cross between Half-Life 2 and the Unity Asset Store. Thinking back now, I honestly can't recall a single distinct looking thing about this game, though that could be more attributed to the time period. Quite a few games during the mid to late 2000s use this more muted aesthetic combined with a post-apocalyptic or dystopian setting, so this isn't unfamiliar by any means. What struck me as strange though is that this game is supposed to take place in the year 1939, albeit an alternate timeline 1939, but nothing about it really screamed that time period to me. Sure, through the events of the story, the world has access to better technology than the original timeline, but the only thing that really hints at this time period is the use of a Zeppelin to get around. Other than that, you could easily place this game 20 years later, slap a swastika on the enemies, and call it Wolfenstein Back in Time for the New Order, and I don't think anyone would question it. The same thing goes for the look of the suit that your character has in game. It looks like Gray, Gordon, Fox, Freeman, DeLorean. Couple that with the fact that most of your comrades look exactly the same and appear to be into Negan cosplay, and we have a pretty bland looking game. Adding to the sense of being forgettable is the main story. Look, I'm spoiling this game, which isn't a huge deal, but spoiler warning in case anyone cares. The story starts in a laboratory where a new time-traveling suit is being developed. The head scientist, Dr. Crone, steals the alpha prototype suit and travels to the past, leaving a bomb behind to kill everyone else. You get into the beta suit and jump into the past after him, but arrive in an alternate version of 1939 where Crone has taken over the world. During a fight, your suit is damaged, which prevents you from returning to the present, so you have to hunt Crone down in order to take the needed parts from his suit so that you can return home. So, right there. If the main character was to try and return to his time period, then wouldn't he just arrive in a future version of the world created by Crone? Are we operating on Back to the Future rules here, or is it a multiverse? I honestly don't think this was ever considered, and I'll get into why later, but for now, we have our call to action, which is to get back home. So in order to get to Crone, you decide to join up with the Resistance. The Resistance doesn't really ask any questions and just sort of accepts that you have the ability to manipulate time. Granted, you are trying to kill the leader of the oppressive regime, and they need all of the help that they can get, so I guess it's not too far-fetched that they wouldn't look a time-jumping gift horse in the mouth. You help the Resistance out a little bit by helping free some prisoners, you steal a Zeppelin and a dropship, and you go to confront Crone, who is piloting a massive death machine. You shoot the 4 weak points on the death machine to defeat it, and Crone comes flying out. You kill Crone, take the parts you need, and travel back to the present to save your girlfriend, I guess? I don't know, it's not really implied that she's your girlfriend. The main character calls her to offer her a business proposition, quote unquote, which is presumably an offer for her to spy on Crone. Then it cuts to you two in bed after a night of festivities, and the rest of the cutscenes are just extensions of that scene where you talk about Crone. Not exactly romantic. Well, saving your sort of girlfriend triggers a paradox somehow, and you're ejected from that timeline, which may have been an attempt at sequel bait. Overall, this story just felt weak and stitched together at the last minute, and I thought that before looking into this game's development. I finished TimeShift in a little over 5 hours, which is fine as far as an acceptable campaign length for an FPS game is considered. The game also had a multiplayer component, but it's only accessible via LAN now. I actually absent-mindedly selected online multiplayer to see if anyone might actually still be playing this game, only to immediately notice the huge powered by GameSpy logo that I had somehow missed. Yeah, gonna go out on a limb and say those servers may not be up anymore. I did load up a map though and walk around just to check it out. It was a standard tight corridor shooter map, nothing outstanding, though I did notice that the time powers were changed to grenades, so you throw a slow grenade to slow down an enemy. That must have been fun for the receiving end. After finishing the game, I looked into the development of TimeShift and found out some rather interesting things about it. Apparently, TimeShift was originally going to launch in 2006 with a different, more steampunky look, along with a totally different story. A demo was put out in May 2006 via Xbox Magazine and received very negative impressions. Shortly after that, in August 2006, the game was delayed to 2007. Then it was announced that Saber Interactive was not just going to be ironing out bugs and whatnot, but was actually going to be significantly overhauling the game. Per an IGN Australia article at the time, and I quote, "We're talking about a completely new script, jettisoning the first 4 levels entirely, incorporating a new setting and visual style, redesigning the main character and enemies, tweaking the time control mechanics, and extensively upgrading the engine to support weather effects, shadow maps, HDR lighting, high-res textures, improved materials, soft particles, depth of field, far more detailed models, and a new physics engine." To quote something that a friend once said to me when I had unrealistic expectations for a project that I was working on, that's ambitious. I'll say that whenever I hear about a game that has had a drastic overhaul in the final year of development, it almost never ends well. I think of Destiny 1 specifically in that regard, which had a miserable launch due to an overhaul of the game about a year prior to launch. Doing that much work to a game in the span of a year is bound to run a team into the ground and cause a lot of issues. While I will say that, technically speaking, I didn't run into any game-breaking bugs or anything like that, the lack of polish is 100% visible in the presentation, as I've already explained. With the knowledge of this overhaul happening late in development, it all seems to make more sense now. That doesn't really help with the general feeling that I get when rolling credits on this game though. It's just a solid meh. TimeShift is not a bad game, but it isn't a particularly noteworthy one either. I'm not mad that I bought it at the price that I paid, which is something that I can't say for another game that I bought recently that I just can't be bothered to write a review for. Whether or not I recommend the game, however, comes with some conditions. If you just want a game that is a pretty good first-person shooter and don't really care about the look or the campaign story at all, and you're okay dealing with some minor jank that is rooted in that time period, then I think you might like it, but wait for a sale like I did. Otherwise, I don't really have a compelling reason to recommend this game to anyone else. TimeShift is available on Steam, GOG, Xbox 360, and Xbox One via backwards compatibility. Thank you all for watching, happy gaming, and I'll see you next time. Later.